Well, good afternoon to you all, and welcome to Manchester. And this, which I believe is the opening session in the Think Tent, which is the place to be during Tory Party conference for stimulating debate on ideas of substance. If you thought that this was a warm-up session, you would be mistaken. This is the headline event of the Think Tank's panel offering over the course of the next couple of days. And there can be no more important topic than the debate between spending rises and tax cuts, the relationship between spending rises and tax cuts, and to explore this in the context of the declaration made a year ago that austerity is over. We are therefore invited to consider what it was, whether it achieved its aims, and what it means to say, and for a Conservative government to say that it is over, particularly when faced with an opposition party who would like to raise taxes where they don't exist, raise them further where they do exist, spend, and a Tory party that has got to find something to offer an electorate beyond, as it says on the banner outside, getting Brexit done. So it's my great pleasure to inform you that we have three esteemed members of Parliament to chew over this debate: Julian Knight, Andrew Bowie, Steve Baker, and then flanking them we have John O'Connell and Kate Andrews, two of this country's foremost campaigners and thinkers on all the right matters. My name's Christian May. I'm of City AM. I've come up from London mostly to spend my time in the IEA's company over the next few days. It's a great pleasure. I'm sure I'll see more and more of you. So, as the topic of this debate puts it, the end of austerity is the context, and we can debate that subject for a long time. But we will also be talking about the virtues of tax cuts, the potential for spending hikes, and the relationship between those two concepts. And we'll talk about them up here for half an hour or so, but I'm keen to bring in questions from the audience as soon as possible. Indeed, try to control yourselves, but if something is said up here in the first half hour which is so provocative to you that you simply must intervene, you can stick your hand in the air. But we'll keep all questions when they come to nice, pithy, to the point questions. But we will start by inviting our panel to consider the topic that we've put forward for 3 or 4 minutes before I'll grill them a little more in detail on some of these points, I hope, and then we'll open it up to you. So, Steve Baker, why don't you start with your vantage position on Treasury Select Committee and a long and glorious career discussing all the more interesting elements of economics and policy. Why don't you open us up and get this conversation started?
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure you'd be very surprised indeed if I did not say that, of course, tax cuts are better than spending hikes. Why would we be here if we didn't believe that? But why do we believe it? Well, if you cut taxes, then you enlarge the field of voluntary activity, and voluntary activity leaves space for things like responsibility and virtue, choosing for yourself to do the right thing, giving people the dignity of determining their own destiny. So, of course, we're here because we believe we want to enlarge the field of liberty. I think we're all here for that. And if we want to enlarge liberty, then, of course, cutting taxes is a good thing because it does just that. People sometimes talk about the third sector. I'm a huge fan of the third sector, but the third sector is funded either through taxation or through voluntary contributions. So, you know, I would like to see us voluntarily doing the right thing far more often in this world, whether it's through our own private spending, through charities, cooperatives, or friendly societies, but I don't want to get too off topic. So we need to start asking ourselves really important questions about economic efficiency and social returns and what we're trying to do as Conservatives and as a government. And there was a really amazing report from the 2020 Tax Commission, came out a few years ago now. It uses complex terms like deontology and utilitarianism and virtue ethics, and it's a thumping good read. And I'm not going to go through all of it now, but I did revisit it. But I want to try and keep things back to the practical politics for a moment, because, you know, for me, representing Wickham in Buckinghamshire, one of the big problems I've got with the latest hospital announcement today is it doesn't say we're getting a new hospital in Wickham. Because a new hospital in Wickham, I tell you, that would be awfully popular. We've got a PFI that's quite new, but not especially brilliant for serving the public. And we've got a very, very tired old tower which needs replacing. So I'm afraid when you're in practical politics, complicated things like deontology and utilitarianism and virtue ethics go out the window because I'd like a new hospital. So let's talk for a moment about where the money goes. I want to just briefly tell you the story of Sue, and I can tell you the story of Sue because she just told this story at the AGM of Bucks Carers. So Sue, when her husband was 61, found that she became a carer. And she became a carer because her husband started behaving oddly, and it turned out he'd had some sort of early onset dementia. And this poor lady in her early 60s, when she would rather have continued working and looking after themselves, they both would, they found that he was unable to work and she was a carer. Now, I couldn't speak for her politics, but I think I can spot a person who's likely to vote for us as a robust and resilient person who copes, but I spotted a person who actually needed the help of the state. So that brings me on to the County Council, because we are joined by one of our excellent county councillors here today in Buckinghamshire, and the county councils have all really been struggling. I don't know if there's anybody here from Northamptonshire, but if Buckinghamshire didn't take very careful measures, it too would be in trouble. And it's the county council that funds helping people like Sue. And then you get into looking where the money goes. So I'm just glancing at the red book here. Social protection's 256 billion. By the time you've added in personal social services, health and education, you're easily looking at 2/3 of £842 billion. So really this brings me on to where I really want our conversation to be as Conservatives. I'm really delighted to be in the think tent because my great friend Syed Kamal has joined the IEA. And Syed really wants to advance the same arguments I do. We've got to create the conditions whereby we show people that we could all do better for one another, not just for ourselves, but for one another, if we enlarged liberty in the fields of providing for areas of real human need. Because the problem we've got, particularly if you look forward at age-related spending, is we're not going to be able to sustain all of this spending. I haven't even begun to touch on social care, special educational needs, universal credit, which should have more funding, I believe, and the defence estate. Go and visit the officers' mess at RAF High Wycombe. It's a real tatty mess. So this is the problem that we face. There were a bunch of recommendations in that 2020 Tax Commission report, like cutting taxes to 33% of national income, marginal tax rates not exceeding 30%, and so on. They're all stacked up really well. It's what we ought to do. But I suppose where I want to finish my opening remarks is to say that the challenge for all of us as Conservatives is we need to enlarge the field of human liberty and promote prosperity by doing more than just cutting taxes. We've got to start working out new ways where we can help people like Sue and her husband with early onset dementia, help them to cope in their own homes with greater support, and that's going to mean each of us choosing as Conservatives to provide a lead, doing things, dare I say, in the big society, and showing people that actually we're on the moral high ground, and that if people want to provide more effectively for one another in this society, they should be voting Conservative, choosing voluntarily to help one another, and yes, cutting taxes.
Thank you, Steve. We will return to the moral question at the heart of this, and I'm glad you raised it. People will make a moral case for spending in certain areas. Steve wants a new hospital. Don't know if you picked that up. But
Dear Matt Hancock.
Andrew, where do you stand on the field of human liberty?
Well, I mean, firstly, thank you very
Firmly,
much for
I bet.
very firmly. Thank you very much for inviting me along. It's great to be in the think tent today, and it's great to be here to address the question why tax cuts are better than spending hikes. I believe that on the whole they are, and I can say that because, as some of you will have already picked up, I'm a member of Parliament with the privilege of representing a constituency in Scotland. And Scotland is a fantastic place. I mean, and you've laid on the weather, especially for us today. Scotland is a great place to live and work. It's a great place to do business. But unfortunately, it is being run with the most economically incompetent and illiterate administration that has ever has ever governed any part of our United Kingdom. And I say that because it is a government that is spending more per head on services than the UK government is. But it's doing so through increasing tax. We are the highest taxed part of the United Kingdom, and despite the fact that we pay more per head in tax than any other part of this country. The Scottish Government raised £940 million less than expected last year. And the UK Government had to add £737 million to the block grant to make up the difference. I mean, who saw this coming? It's almost as if we warned the Scottish Government that if they increased tax, and the tax revenue might go down. I have you know the Scottish Conservatives did make this case, made it loudly, and made it to a man who holds the position of Finance Minister in the Scottish Government, who hadn't even heard of the Laffer curve and had no idea what it was. If you don't believe me, look it up. In front of a committee of the Scottish Parliament, he had to have explained to him by the Scottish Conservative finance spokesman. As Theresa May's former PPS, I'm bound to say that I absolutely stand by her comments made last year at Conservative Party conference that the age of austerity is coming to an end. And I say that because it's demonstrably true. I mean, when we came into power in 2010 in the coalition, this government, for every £1 that we were spending, £1 in every £30 that we were spending was borrowed. And now it's £1 in every 4 was borrowed. Now it's £1 in every 30, which I think is huge progress and a real demonstration that this government has taken the steps necessary to deal with the economic crisis that we inherited on the back of a profligate and incompetent Labour administration when we came in 2010. But it's not an either-or. I don't think, obviously, tax cuts are better than spending hikes. But, of course, spending increases are very important as well. And we've seen the announcement today, and we've seen how well that announcement has gone down. And Steve's obviously spoken about how he really wants a new hospital in High Wycombe. 40 new hospitals, £13 billion extra being invested in the health service. I mean, this is really, really important. But it's not, at the expense of tax cuts, in my view. We can do both. We can increase spending in the areas that we need to, whilst advocating a low-tax economy. And I think it's about time that we did so.
Thank you. Julian.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you for inviting me here today. As I'm no longer in the Treasury, I can now talk about tax, which is really good. And maybe with a little bit more disclosure than I may have done in the past in that respect. I mean, in my view, we are now we are tax proportionally greater than we've ever been in living memory, and that's just a fact. But if you ask most people on the doorstep, they really wouldn't realise that. They really wouldn't understand it. And part of the reason for that is there is a real dishonesty at the heart of the taxation system, which is the fact that we have effectively moved away from personal direct taxation into indirect taxation. And this was something that was first brought about in the early 1990s when we had a serious economic downturn, but we didn't, under any circumstances, we had a major deficit, I think it was around about 10% of GDP, and we didn't want to raise personal taxation because we thought to ourselves that this was the great thing from Thatcherism, that we had lowered taxation from the years of Callaghan, etc. So we didn't do it, and then we started to raise indirect taxation, and that little wheeze then was carried on with alacrity by Brown and Blair in their years. So we've now ended up in a situation where, frankly, people don't really know what their tax burden actually is. They don't quite realise and can't actually see where the tax begins or tax starts, and they don't understand as well, perhaps, the fundamentals that are very simple fundamental. Every single penny in this economy is raised by a business. Nothing else is. Nothing else generates. It's all related to business and then is recycled through the taxation system to provide services, which then have a multiplier effect. But in themselves, they aren't as efficient as that first burst of energy from a business in terms of taxation. However, more pressingly, we're facing tremendous demographic pressures. People are living longer, but they're living less well. And that's absolutely crucial. Steve touched on this in his example in his own constituency, and frankly, I've got hundreds, if not thousands, of that on the doors in Solihull of people who are living day to day, frankly, for years, effectively in very serious medical conditions or as carers, and are effectively, therefore, they are contributing to our society, of course they are, but in terms of tax take, they aren't contributing, they are effectively receiving. Now, the realities are that also people have greater expectation of what the public sector should provide for them. It seems to be that everyone seems to just into the first line. I mean, for crying out loud, am I really serious here that we've actually had a discussion about trying to save a travel company? Is that actually something that we would even have seen 10, 15, 20 years ago? However, the left have managed to move the dial to such an extent, and we've indulged ourselves in a cultural cringe as Conservatives that we've not been robust enough to make the case to actually say that, frankly,
The government should not be running a travel company. So we do have this situation here where we have, effectively, there are greater expectations of what the government should do, or the government can do. Well, actually, the best sort of government is actually keeping out of people's lives and letting business and letting individuals deal with it. We also have a situation where the public sector inflation is far higher than GDP or productivity. This is the case that Andrew mentioned in Scotland. I mean, the realities are that ever since the great financial crash, I mean, a very substantial proportion of the deficit has been due, in fact, to the lack of productivity in areas, as Scotland under the SNP. If we look at the GDP ratio now in Scotland, it's around about 4%, isn't it? UK-wide, it should be about 1.1%. In more productive areas, we're actually paying into the exchequer. So, in that respect, we have this public sector inflation is far higher than GDP growth. So every penny you put in doesn't go as far into the public sector. So, Labour's answer to this demographic squeeze, to this greater expectations, to the fact that public services are racing away in terms of their cost, is effectively to redistribution, what they call redistribution, but it's actually just the politics of envy and basically land, and literally now land grab. And we therefore have to face this head on and understand that we have to come out from our cultural cringe and actually say to people, hold on a minute, there is actually ways in which we can do this, and we can once again talk about greater competition into the public sector. And we need to basically effectively sort of calibrate public services to increase people's productive time in the workforce as contributors. Because that way, that means that the end game, so to speak, in terms of services, in terms of things like social care, you actually will have more resource to go round because it will be for less time. And you'll have more contributions and less drain on the public exchequer. So I just, and also one point, of course, is obviously, having worked briefly at the DWP, the DWP budget, of course, is actually higher than the GDP of Portugal. So that's always something that we need to note in that regard. So I would say very simply that we need to get away from that cultural cringe. We need to effectively recognise the challenges we face, and we need to actually be confident in the arguments that we put.
Thank you very much. Kate, you live most, if not all of your life in this debate. Certainly every time I turn on the TV is anything to go by. What do you think are the main elements to this argument?
Well, it's funny that we're painting it as an argument or a question because we've been quite cheeky, the IEA and the TPA. We didn't actually paint it as a question in the title. We said, why are they? Because they clearly are. Tax cuts are clearly better than spending hikes for several reasons. The first is that the tax burden's at a near 50-year high. If you think that spending is the priority over cutting taxes when people have seen their taxes going up and up and up for the better part of 5 decades, you know, something incredible has to be convincing you to be moving it in the upward direction. And in terms of the end of austerity, obviously being a member of the IEA, I have to push the politicians on the panel a bit to say whether or not we had austerity to begin with. Now, don't get me wrong, certain parts of public spending were cut, and they were cut in major ways, and I might even argue they were disproportionately cut. If you were young, if you were on welfare, you probably felt those cuts more than, say, elderly people who were living on very nice pension packages, but cuts did happen. Overall, however, during the coalition government, only 0.5% of spending in real terms was cut per annum. It was not the mass cuts that not just the Labour Party, but many people painted it as. The reality is that we've been spending and spending and spending, and now is probably the time to roll some of that back and to talk about tax cuts. And the first thing I say is that not all taxes are created equally. Taxes on mobile capital, taxes, high marginal tax rates on income tax and the rest affect growth disproportionately and hurt people's pockets disproportionately. And the UK has a particularly badly designed system. We target the wrong areas and we affect people's pockets and we affect growth. Property taxes are the key here. I mean, we just keep racking up really bad kinds of property taxes, stamp duty being at the top of the list. So looking at the kinds of ways that we tax people is key, but also looking at how much we're spending and how much we need to tax. So government spending as a proportion of national income in the UK is roughly similar to Germany, but it's considerably higher than places like Switzerland, Australia, or Ireland. And it's also higher than places like Canada, the US, or New Zealand. Now what this says to me is that if you're looking at countries like Australia or Switzerland that have quite generous welfare packages, have quite generous safety nets and support systems, and even giveaways, you don't have to be spending as much in order to deliver it. So it's not to say that you have to just do cuts across the board and leave people without. It's to say we're clearly not doing them as efficiently as countries like Switzerland that I think are often thought to be more generous than the UK. The IEA back in 2015 proposed some radical tax reform ideas to bring spending down significantly, so the government would raise only about 20 to 25% of national income through tax. And we actually found that if you were to target certain kinds of taxes, the poorest could see some of the most benefits from that, because, as Julian was saying, these taxes by stealth really hurt the poor the most. And I think what's interesting about the current government's position on tax is that they really have targeted the middle class. And I think in many ways quite rightly so. Taking people out of that 40% tax bracket is important because nearly 2 million people have been pulled into it since 2000. The number of people in it has actually tripled since 1990. People have been doing well for themselves. They've been moving, from earning, 20, 30,000 pounds a year to earning 50 or 60,000 pounds a year, and they're being punished for doing so. So I think it's the right target, but we can't forget the lowest paid when we're talking about tax as well. So I think tackling our tax brackets and our marginal tax rates, but also looking at things like national insurance, which is essentially a stealth tax, bringing it in line with the personal allowance or abolishing it altogether, looking at things like stamp duty that are keeping young people off of the housing ladder, looking at the apprenticeship levy, which is actually stopping a lot of businesses from hiring those younger people into those new roles, looking at sin taxes, which we know are most regressive and affect the poor the most. I think we have to keep all of these groups in mind when we're talking about tax cuts, and it is time, because for all the talk of tax cuts and what people are getting back in their pockets, there just hasn't been enough, and there hasn't been enough for decades.
Okay, now I know Steve Baker is particularly keen to come back and join the conversation about whether there was austerity, but I also can sense that John O'Connell is chomping at the bit to get into this conversation. John.
Thanks, Christian. I'm going to touch on two themes, and I'll do it very quickly so we can have a broader conversation. The strapline of this conference is get Brexit done and invest in our NHS, police and schools. And I can imagine that that's an extremely popular message in the focus groups and in the polling and all the rest of the data work being done by government. But guess what? Tax cuts are popular as well. We've done our own polling, and for the sake of the blood pressure of our campaign team, I won't mention any of the details because it's out on Tuesday, but some of the broader themes that are drawn out of it are, given that we specifically asked people in the C to D bracket, or working class voters, if you want to give it an easier title, a couple of themes were drawn out. They're up for bold ideas. They're up for big changes. They don't necessarily just want little tweaks at the edges. So when we pitch sort of TPA-friendly, bold tax cuts, actually, they're quite popular. Big cuts to income tax, and quite surprisingly as well, big cuts to corporation tax. Now, there's this sense that everybody hates big business, et cetera, but actually this cohort of voters, they understand that big businesses are important. They're job creators. They create lots of jobs in provincial towns, and they do understand that they can up and leave anytime they want. So while they may not love big business in a real, definite way, they certainly respect them, and they don't necessarily want them to leave their towns. So, tax cuts can be extremely popular. The second thing I'd say is to draw on something that Andrew mentioned, which is tax cuts and spending increases at the same time. What I'd like to see is the Treasury introduce much more dynamic modelling into their own tax changes or suggested tax changes. Quite often we see the static model. If you cut taxes, you'll lose this much in revenue. And then that's perpetuated by groups like the Resolution Foundation and Institute for Fiscal Studies. And it leads to much poorer debate on tax, in the media space as well, because obviously those groups are seen as, the respected IFS. But I'd like to see much more dynamic modelling introduced. It's been trialled before by the Treasury. I'm sure the MPs on the panel will know more about this than me, but as far as I was aware, the CGE model was trialled for fuel duty and corporation tax, and both had good results in terms of the effects of cutting tax. So it's not just good for growth, but it could be good for receipts as well. And if we had more dynamic modelling and we were testing tax changes properly, we could have a much more informed debate, and possibly if we do get Brexit done, the strapline at next year's conference could be cut taxes and invest in our NHS, police and schools.
Something to look forward to. I'm going to delve into a few of the points that have been raised. Steve, I know first you wanted to just have a conversation with Kate regarding some of the points you made about austerity.
Yeah, so Kate's wanted to press the politicians on the point, did we have austerity? And I'm afraid it's got a threefold answer, because the answer is no, yes, and we will do. Because the answer is no, because, as Kate suggests, from the top down, no, we didn't have austerity. If you look at the big macro numbers, no. But the answer, of course, is yes, if you're a community that's losing libraries or can't get the social care that you thought you were going to get, and so on and so on. So if you're running a council, certainly we had austerity. And the reason I say we will do is that I'm just looking at the fiscal sustainability report, and I will just wave it around. There's a yellow line on there, which some of you might be able to see, sort of departs off. It's a projection of the national debt, and by about 2060 it's going through 250% of GDP. And it just breezily says in the report, needless to say, in practice, policy would need to change long before this date to prevent this outcome. I pressed them on the Treasury Committee because, of course, that is a catastrophe for the public services to get up to debt of 250%. But that is what the promise of the welfare state is. The welfare state's promised everybody everything, and it turns out it implies a catastrophic projection of debt. So that's why I want us to do more to promote the ideas of liberty outside the state. And to John's point, if I may, just very briefly, of course tax cuts are popular, spending rises are also popular, and that's why we end up borrowing so much and in this mess.
Andrew, I'm looking at Steve's line.
Yeah. Slightly distracted by it.
Yeah. It stays with you, that one. Are we getting to the point where we can have conversations and panels like this where we can talk about some specific tax reforms, which we will in a minute? Kate, you alluded to some. But are we getting to a point ultimately where we say, if we want the state to provide X, it will no longer be able to provide Y?
Well, I hope not. But very, very possibly. I think, to go back on something that Julian said earlier about the cultural cringe, I mean, I think Julian is absolutely right. We're just not bold enough to actually sell these radical arguments. I mean, going back to Thomas Cook, I mean, as conservatives, I think we were even scared to even put up a defence of why it was not a good idea for the government to be investing or owning a travel company. Nobody was actually going out and making that argument. But yeah, we are coming close to a time where hard decisions are going to have to be made, to answer your question directly. As Steve said, tax cuts are popular, but spending increases are popular as well. And, you know, I think we really need to look very hard at what we as a party can offer in the years to come to combat that catastrophic forecast that was put there. But we have to remember, as Steve said earlier on, you know, practical politics of this. And if you were somebody on universal credit or going on to universal credit, if you were serving in the armed forces, if you were young, if you were running a library or running a council, then we absolutely had austerity. And seeing more money coming into those budgets is overtly a very good thing. People also like having more of the money that they earn in their pockets. And I think that essentially that's a very conservative argument to make. It's just one that we haven't been making very strongly of late.
Julian, I've no doubt that you and your parliamentary colleagues would agree that you would prefer to be in government. But when we're talking about some of the radicalism that John wants to promote, no, I know that Steve has always got up his sleeve. Is it easier for a political party to have that debate and make those arguments from a position of opposition?
I think that we have that luxury, frankly, with the Corbyn government, potential Corbyn government.
Or we'll come on to him.
Yeah, we you know, the realities are that we have to focus with the here and now. We have to try and reinvigorate ourselves, effectively 9 years into government or semi-government. And that's a very difficult thing to do. It just generally doesn't happen. But we do have an opportunity due to the policies of Jeremy Corbyn, which I believe are toxic, and I think will, once explained to the public, will mean that they are unable to form a government and they're unable to get the support, and that we should be able to win a majority in the next general election. So in that respect, we do actually, it's on beholden ourselves, we have an opportunity now, beyond Brexit, to actually genuinely sort of reinvigorate, unlike almost any other government has done in the past.
On Jeremy Corbyn, I think the Tories in the room and in Manchester could take some comfort from the fact that he is unpopular. But they ought to reflect on the fact that his policies are not unpopular. He is an unpopular populist. And a lot of his economic positions and policies, they poll well, they're received well, and actually they sound quite attractive to large numbers of people. So we'll come on to those perhaps, and perhaps you'll have questions on that. I just want to talk about some of the language used around the tax debate in particular. Somebody mentioned the IFS a moment ago, and I was just familiarising myself with their latest set of observations on the Tory party's mooted tax cuts, not least around income tax. And the IFS will always talk about a cost to any tax cut. You can do it, but it's going to cost you. You can raise that threshold, but it's going to cost you. So on the income tax point, I think responding to Boris's flirtation with raising the threshold to 80,000 for the higher rate, the IFS have said you can do it, but it's going to cost you, and therefore you'll have to pay for it by putting the additional rate on anybody who earns more than 80,000. So for them and for many others, it is always a case of tax cuts are going to cost you necessarily, and you have to pay for them somehow. Where has the debate gone about the sort of the more robust debate about the self-fulfilling benefits of tax cuts? Kate, I know you make those arguments, but do you think they've disappeared somewhat from political debate?
Well, they've absolutely disappeared. It's as if the state owns 100% of any kind of wealth or money, and they're so gracious as to give it to you. It's costing them to give you back your own money. So the language and the debate around it is pretty horrific. Now, I do have some sympathy with those who flag fiscal responsibility. If you do just cut taxes across the board and you start borrowing to pay for the same level of public services or the same inefficient delivery of public services, because I do think we could deliver a lot more for a lot less money, that is, that is irresponsible. That is a tax on my generation, on people younger than me, on people down the road. It does have to be paid back at some point. So I definitely have a soft spot for that. But again, it goes back to the kinds of taxes that you want to target. If you abolish stamp duty and along with that liberalize the planning system and start building homes, the growth from that's going to be remarkable. We saw through cuts to corporation tax that actually you can increase tax revenue. I think some taxes are actually slightly harder. VAT, when we talk about austerity, we always talk about spending cuts. We don't talk about tax hikes. VAT was raised from 17.5% to 20% because of austerity. That was what the taxpayer had to contribute. It hasn't gone back down. But if you were to bring it back down, I think the estimate is it would cost, upwards of £15 billion to do, and you'd have to find, how to fill that black hole somehow. Some taxes are more efficient than others. Some are going to be, in the IFS language, more costly than others. But we're just looking over loads of areas where you could cut tax and probably boost growth and to a remarkable level to fill in that space. So when we talk about costing, it doesn't just have to do with the money that currently exists. We should be talking about growth as well.
John.
One more thing on the language, it applies on the spending side as well, right? On the tax side, I agree, budget day bingo in the TPA office, giveaways, thanks for giving away my own money back to me, But on the spending side, it happens as well, right? With when spending increases by less than was originally forecast, it's called a cut, even though spending is going up. And that kind of language is very pervasive in the debate, and it's perpetuated by most of the big broadcasters and doesn't really help matters.
Okay, let's see if there are some people in the audience who wish to contribute. Yes, sir, at the back.
Hello. I think, as a party, we're getting a little bit too attracted to the sexy idea of giving away, hiking spending, and I think it goes back to the point that Andrew raised about we're now borrowing 1 in £32, or whatever it was, and when we came in it was 1 in 4, and we're fed up as Tories of doing the hard times and not giving away anymore. But at the end of the day, we're not still in debt, we're still increasing that debt for future generations. And therefore I want to ask each one of the panel members, should it be the end of austerity?
Okay, let's start with our MPs. Julian.
Yeah, I think, first of all, we do have to recognise there's huge pent-up demand in certain parts of the public sector. I worked in the MOJ and that faced a 40% cut, and literally it means that people are, going back to slopping out with broken windows in Liverpool jail. We're having riots everywhere. That's one of the issues we've had in terms of the prison sector. Unfortunately, now we've started to actually start to improve standards in that area. But that's just an example. We do have a real sort of fraying of the infrastructure of a lot of our public sector. But it doesn't mean all because we say end of austerity and that we actually need to refocus on these areas, it doesn't mean that we should, and actually it is beholden on us to actually try and reform, to try and bring better value to the taxpayer, and saying that, okay, we're spending this money, but at the same time, we are hoping to, or we want to actually have productivity increases as a result of that.
Andrew, the Tories, if they're known for anything, are known for trust on the economy, economic competence, etc. How risky is it to play with that? Indeed, is it in play just by virtue of the billions that Boris Johnson is announcing every day of the week at the moment?
I think it's incredibly risky, but just to answer the question directly, should it be the end of austerity? No, but I hope it's the end of us using the phrase austerity. Yeah. It should not be the end of sensible management of the public finances, which is essentially what Conservative governments are thanked and known for. The problem, I think, is that we've ceded much of the ground on this, and certainly the language, we've fallen into the trap of using the language of the left. So we talk about austerity, we talk about cuts, and what we should be talking about is sensible management of the economy, which is what we have done since we came in 2010. But there were cuts. I mean, you can't get away from that. And some of them were very hard for people to take in certain sectors, as the other MPs have said. And we've got a responsibility as a government, not just to sensibly manage the economy, but also to deliver and help those people who are who are struggling and who were struggling as a result of the decisions that we had to take when we came in 2010.
And when you mention debt, Steve Baker's ears just shoot up a level.
Oh, let's talk about currency debasement as well.
Have you got your coin on you?
I have, of course.
Of course he has.
Your point about austerity is really well made, but people need hope and joy in their lives. So if we're just the party of austerity, right, that is not a winning proposition. So what I might like to say we should do is we've got to smile more. I'm trying to lead on that one. We've all got to start looking like we're enjoying serving the public. But what I might suggest we do is have austerity for the state, prosperity for you. Yeah? Austerity for the state, prosperity for you. And since I am here with the TPA, there is a rich seam of work to be done with FOIs on the cost of, for example, knocking down a wall in an office so you can turn it into a conference room and then putting it back up a few weeks later. The cost of the furniture they put in there is, I mean, I wouldn't raise it if it wasn't so unbelievably high, the way they equip ministers' offices. I personally practiced austerity in government, and actually, right across government, we need ministers from the top down to practice austerity for the state and prosperity for the public. Because actually, the whole of the state, little secret, having been a minister now, the whole thing is set up as if ministers were little princelings. It's like the civil service is looking forward to the day when the monarchy takes over again. We've got, therefore, since the whole state looks up to ministers, every single minister has got to be thinking, how do we implement austerity for government?
Well, John, Steve, you've made John smile, and so we'll ask why in a moment. But Julian, you wanted to come.
I just wanted to say I do agree with that, but also, just actually the number of government departments, for instance, there's 23 government departments. At the US has 15, I believe. Mm-hmm. Absolutely ridiculous. We don't need that many government departments. We also, frankly, we have too much business support, big business support. I've been over on trade missions, and literally we're trying to give money away. And sometimes you just feel as if we put the cart before the horse so often in this regard. And what we actually need is to really streamline. If we really, as you say, if we really want to talk about value for money, we have to set an example in Whitehall itself. And this isn't the usual Brown 30,000 civil servants, etc., that he sort of tried to go on about when he was towards the back end of his premiership. This is frankly about departments disappearing and government not shrinking, but at least making the impression that it's going, putting across the idea it's going to be streamlined and that waste is going to be cut.
Well, of course, we'll get rid of DexEU after the 31st of October, Julian.
Yes.
So that'll be one day.
I think it's been got rid of already, but it's just still there somehow.
John, your thoughts on the gentleman's question?
I was smiling because Steve's just given us some very good FOI ideas, which I saw somebody.
I'll help you with them later.
One of the member of staff got their phone out and probably writing them down. I think it's sort of a mixture of various points. I think the word austerity itself is the wrong one, and it's living within your means. But I don't think that that's where it should stop. You shouldn't just talk about living within your means because you quite enjoy balancing the books. What does it mean for people? What does it mean for their lives? A good practical example of this Well, you know, in the debate in our own country, when we the Conservative government were cutting corporation tax, and you know, in and of itself, good, great. But then the story stopped. And in America at the moment, with Trump's tax cuts, and you may agree or disagree with some of the granular stuff, but over there, a list was being kept of all of the businesses that were increasing the pay and bonuses and the 401ks of their staff, and that was a positive message that was coming out from the Trump tax cuts. That's what we've got to do more of here. It's not just about cutting tax because we enjoy it and small c conservatives or whatever else. We've got to do it because it makes people's lives better, and we've got to say why and how and keep those practical examples and use them every single day.
Kate?
That's such an important point, just to piggyback on that. In the States, from Alaskan Airlines to Walmart, there's this massive list of what the actual number you can put to the bonuses that they gave employees or the percentage of the pay increase. And that makes it real for people. It's obviously very real when your paycheck comes through, but it's real on a broader sense that your neighbor and your family might also be getting that pay raise too, which is, you know, the community aspect, I think, that conservatives are so often in touch with. You know, I think the government, again, not to be too soft here, but they did the coalition government and the majority, for as long as it lasted, did manage to bring down the deficit quite significantly. I mean, there was improvement, but they sold it in the worst way. They pretended as if they were slashing across the board when they really weren't. They were slashing in very targeted areas, felt by very targeted people, but they did not slash across the board. They've not actually put the UK in a position where if another recession comes along, we're all going to be comfortable and fine. I mean, we're still wildly spending outside of one's means. But they use the rhetoric as if we were. They use the rhetoric as if we have to experience this pain for a decade and it'll all be over. Actually, in many areas, they didn't touch anything at all. And we have a rising and aging population. You know, issues around welfare and healthcare and social care and pensions are going to come to the front, and we haven't touched those. Everyone's too frightened to. I'm very sympathetic to what you say, because we're going to have to make some really tough decisions down the line, and the pickle that we're in, that the past decade of politics has gotten us in, is that when you turn to people and say, we're going to cut again, we have to in this area or that area, they can rightly say, I thought you just did that the past decade. And you can't just perpetually be telling people you're going to slash everything. If you're going to do that, actually do it. Don't pretend you're doing it in every area and only target certain areas.
I don't know who's read it, but David Cameron conceded in his memoirs that he wished he went further. Perhaps on the
Great
same
timing,
page,
David.
on the same page as Kate Andrews. I'm very keen to get more questions. I might dip into the panel with them and then go back out. But yes, there's a gentleman there on the back row whose hand went up quickly.
Luke Evans from Bosworth. Really quick question. Do you think the public is ready to have a sensible discussion about tax cuts or indeed raises, given we tried that in 2017 with the manifesto about social care to have a sensible debate, and it went down like a lead balloon? I wonder what the panel's thoughts are. Are we there yet?
Steve, did the public reward you for honesty?
Yeah, do you know, actually they do. Every election I've stood in, I have told the public, no, we're not going to get A&E back, and explain why. It's due to the developments in medicine. You're now 10 times more likely to live if you have a heart attack, and so on. And if we went back to an A&E of the 1970s, you'd just be more likely to die, and we're not going to get it. And the only way we could get it is by shutting down A&E at Stoke Mandeville, or possibly the John Radcliffe at Oxford and moving everything to Wigan. It's just not going to happen. And every year, all my opponents have said, I will fight to get A&E back. And every year, every general election, every general election, somebody will ring me up and say, Mr. Baker, I usually vote Liberal Democrat, but you've been so honest about the NHS, I'm going to vote for you. So the answer is, they will do it, but you better be right. You better be right, and you better be clear that you're being honest, you're being frank, and it better be clear that what you're saying is actually in their interests. And I think the problem we had when we did it in 17, we sprung it on people, and it was about their home, for God's sake. You know, we're talking to families, look at homes now. I mean, I thank God I own my home now, but there was a time where I was wondering whether I'd ever be able to afford a home. This country's awash with people ever wondering if they'll ever afford a home. And for some of them, the only home they'll ever get is the one that they inherit from their parents or grandparents who got it when they bought their council house from Margaret Thatcher. And silly bastards that we are, we then offered to take it off them to pay for grandparents' social care. And it was just a disaster. So yes, the public will reward you for honesty and integrity in public life. I do believe that. But we really cocked it up.
Yeah, sorry, just to say, I completely agree with Steve. The problem was that in 2017 we sprung these ideas and the debate on people 5 weeks out of a general election which was called for another reason.
Well, they were sprung on you as well, weren't they?
Yeah, well, yeah. But I remember distinctly, and I think that far too often, however, I think far too often we do treat the public like fools, and we don't think we can actually have a grown-up conversation with them. And what I found was that actually people that you engaged with and talked to and talked through the issues, by general election day, they actually got it. But it took a conversation, one-on-one, to explain what these things actually meant and would mean for them, to actually, for people to understand. Because sort of appearing in the newspapers 5 weeks out, splashed over when the Lib Dems crying a dementia tax, you know, that's not a way to have a rational grown-up debate with anybody. But if you take the time to actually engage people in debate, so I was looking around, I remember this question, then I think that they get it. And I think we need to start treating the public like the grown-ups that they actually are.
Julian?
Yeah. No, I do agree. I mean, I do remember that very well. Unfortunately, my car broke down on the way to the manifesto launch, so I'm very grateful for that. And by the way, Dr. Luke, congratulations on being selected as our PPC in Bosworth. Fantastic. And yes, the Lib Dems made hay with that. I had leaflets going out first. Dementia will take your mind. And then Theresa May will take your house, was the leaflet they sent out there. What I would say is, though, that we can actually have a grown-up conversation with people. And strange enough, one of the ways in which we did have a grown-up conversation was over the Labour's plan for an energy price cap. We actually, I thought, won that argument. We actually made the point that this, in the end of the day, messing around with the market such an extent will actually, will not benefit consumers. And then, unfortunately, we decided to give it all away again, rather stupidly. So I do think that we can have a grown-up conversation, but what we do need to do, no nasty surprises, and we do need to put it within the framework and context of our language and not the language of the left.
Okay, yeah, there's a gentleman here in the white shirt.
Hi, John Ashmore. I'm the editor of CapEx, which is very pro-tax cuts. I think it's fair to say. We talked a lot about cuts and rates and different taxes, but what we haven't talked about is simplification. And I'd like to know from the panel where they would like to cut the actual number of taxes. I'm thinking, for example, small businesses, the amount of time they have to waste just sorting their taxes out is ridiculous. And my parent organisation, Centre for Policy Studies, they have a proposal to shrink 4 taxes into 1, and it would be revenue neutral. So, I mean, what kind of things like that could the government do to make life easier, especially for entrepreneurs?
Okay, John, perhaps you could just jump into this, and then I'll ask Julian.
Yeah, Steve alluded to the 2020 Tax Commission report. That was something that the TPA put together with the IOD back in 2012, and that recommends a whole sweeping reform of the tax system. To pick something as an example, taxing distributions of income and getting rid of corporation tax and a whole host of other taxes to make the tax system more modern. Corporation tax itself, outdated. It's probably why it doesn't really matter so much when it gets cut by a percentage point every year. It's sort of a bricks and mortar tax, really, designed in the 1960s when, office over there for white collar, factory over there for blue collar. So replacing a whole host of taxes and taxing distributions of income would be a good way to start. And I know the IEA recommended something similar in tax and growth as well. But taxing distributions at a low, simple rate, a proportionate rate, would get rid of, I can't even remember how many taxes it was. Steve probably knows better than I do, but it was a hell of a lot. But simplification should follow the mantra pretty much of Nigel Lawson, who said he wanted to abolish a tax at every budget. So that's the way we should be going.
Julian, on simplification?
Yeah, well, I as the author of a book on tax, Inheritance Tax for Dummies, I recommend it. It's in any Remainer bin that you'll find in any shop around the country, bookshop. I had the original first edition, the tax book that I actually based on was 250 pages long, and by the third edition it was 900 pages long, and that was, I think, about 5 or 6 years difference. So that just shows an indication of exactly how much our tax code has actually grown in that respect. So I do agree with that, but I also think that we need to end this focus on what I would call life stage taxes. As well, we have to basically get a more honest and transparent discussion about actually where our taxes actually come from and the way in which it seeps into every part of our lives. And I would also say that government departments not only need to be thinned down, but also need to work much more closely together with the objective of ensuring that productivity throughout life, and also transparency and the idea that effectively there is simplification in terms of how people actually deal with government.
Next question.
Can I just say very quickly?
Very quickly, Steve.
We have got an office for tax simplification, and I thank you for everything you do. But if you can help me and whoever else joins me on the Treasury Committee to beat up the Office for Tax Simplification every time they come to see us, please do help us.
Yeah. Yes, the gentleman over there sitting down with... That's right.
Even people like Philip Hammond have suggested that if we leave the EU without a deal, it will require tax cuts to ease our way through that short-term process. What would be a specific agenda that would actually allow businesses and consumers to get through no deal, and hopefully we might find actually keeping those taxes as low as that would be a good thing in the long term as well?
This is an excellent question. Steve, I'm going to start with you. We've heard people flirt with the idea of a radical no-deal budget. Not George Osborne's punishment budget, but slightly more creative and inventive and growth-inspiring budgets. So just talk about that for a second. But also just consider, if you would, all of you, why a radical budget designed for Brexit or no-deal Brexit wouldn't also just be a good budget at any other time. Steve?
So if we leave without a withdrawal agreement, there will be a period where a large range of temporary continuity arrangements kick in for about 6 months, which can be extended. So the first thing is, I think that when you actually look reasonably at what, not what Michel Barnier says at the top, but what they've actually done to smooth an exit with no withdrawal agreement, what you find is that things wouldn't be as dramatic as people like to suggest. I certainly know my wife has booked a holiday in Europe for whenever it is, I can't remember, somewhere skiing after we've left. But what I would say, first one, the obvious one is, if we leave with no withdrawal agreement, the first thing we want to do is avoid raising tariffs. So we should have a radical tariff policy. We're not going to win. I'm not going to go through the arguments for unilateral free trade here today, but we should be making sure we don't drive up tariffs. The other one is thinking, if there is going to be economic disruption, suppose there were, what businesses will need is not corporation tax cut, which they may or may not benefit from later if they've made a profit. They need their costs reduced now. And that means business rates, and it means national insurance, I would suggest. But I'm quite sure that Sajid and the Treasury will have all of this in hand. But that's where I would look first, is to look, and that then plays into your point, because actually cutting business costs day by day, month by month now is a good thing to do in any budget.
Anybody else burning desire to come in on the panel, or should we go to another question?
I was just going to say that a radical budget, a pro-growth budget, a low-tax budget, a pro-business budget, that's a conservative budget. And I think in Sajid Javid we've got a Chancellor who understands that and gets it, and will be delivering just that. But I'm very clear.
You can find out.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Find out. I'll make a note of your question. Yes, the gentleman here in the T-shirt.
Julian Knight just touched on it briefly when I asked a question about social care. You mentioned about trying to introduce sort of like the auto-enrolment idea for which we've had for pensions, making it compulsory across the board for things like healthcare and social care, and trying to move away from the model of tax and spend into more of a savings account, similar to sort of Singapore do their pensions. And I know we talked, as you said, about really growing more, less sort of I don't know, sort of a more grown-up, long-term conversation about it. I just wonder where we could go in terms of that auto-enrolment, sort of how far the scope could be for that.
Okay.
Yeah, this is a really important point, and it goes back to the gentleman in the back row who asked if we can have an honest conversation about these things. And in so many areas, the UK is hand-to-mouth when it comes to feeding its public services. The money that can be spent on the NHS without, say, overly going into debt, is it has to be raised through taxation, right? It has to be raised this year, next year, and on and on. We don't have a piggy bank for these things. And social care especially is an area where I think you can have an honest conversation with younger generations now and say, look, you haven't contributed for very long. We are going to change the system. You are going to have to pay in more, but you're going to get breaks in other ways down the road. And this is the conversation we have to have now. Social care, absolutely. I think you could tackle that more easily than healthcare overall. But we have to talk about the NHS and we have to talk about healthcare, because it is just not going to be sustainable as ratios change between working age people and retired people. So I think it's a really excellent point. We need to have those conversations, and I think we can. If people think it's a fair way of going about it, you can't have that conversation with someone who's 70 years old. It's completely different. It's not fair. They've paid in for their entire working life. You can't turn around and say, sorry, it's not for you. But you can have that conversation with a 25-year-old.
Julian?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add that we did used to actually have not thriving, but we had a certainly significant sector, the insurance sector in this particular area, and that has just disappeared over many years, and this idea effectively of the government taking over. So I think that Kate's point, I think, is really germane to this, that if you are going to move to a system of an insurance system where which you ask people to effectively be auto-enrolled into social care costs, a sort of German model, you do have to give them tax breaks on the other side, because otherwise you are literally just reducing their disposable income. And as we know, the economy really does rely on people's disposable income. So we need to find a way in which, that if you are going to do it, that you actually find your overall tax bill staying neutral in that respect.
Steve?
If we're going to ask people to save for the long term, we've absolutely got to normalise monetary policy. Because we still have what the governor of the bank told the Treasury Committee was extraordinary, if not emergency, monetary policy. You may have seen that, I think it's 1st of November, the ECB is going back to QE. I think it was 20 billion euros a month, wasn't it? And this is madness, but it's the sort of thing people like me have been banging on for a long time. I'm not going to now. But, yes, saving, of course, because it's the civilised and right and responsible thing to do. But asking people to save if we're heading into the territory of negative interest rates is a stupid ask. It won't happen.
Listen, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes, and by show of hands, I am prepared to take either 2 more questions, or if this appeals to you and your hands go up in sufficient numbers now, we can have 4 minutes from Steve Baker on currency debasement. Do you want that? How many hands have gone up for Steve Baker on currency debasement? Enough! Let's have it, Steve.
Well, I wasn't expecting that. Look, you have. For as long as anybody's been willing to listen to me, after the global financial crisis, I've been explaining that we were heading into a global crisis of political economy, and I'm sorry to say I think that is still true. And the resumption of QE in the Eurozone is just part of it. I'm afraid that insofar as we have managed to prop up very high levels of employment, it is corresponding to that extraordinary, if not emergency, monetary policy. And I think all of us are going to have to start asking really serious questions about what is money and how should it work. The reason that Christian, I've got to get it out now, was asking me about it is I always wander around with an ounce of silver in my pocket. Why is it an ounce of silver? Because I can't afford to lose an ounce of gold. But the point is, there was a time when money was a real thing. And now money is something which the ECB can just decide to create at a rate of 20 billion a month. This is crazy. I mean, I think money is the basis of a moral existence. The reason is it allows you to exchange value for value. You, the entrepreneur, produce something valuable. I wish to buy it. I buy it out of value I've produced for somebody else. And so sound money is the basis of a moral existence. That's about the only concept out of Ayn Rand's thinking that I've really enjoyed using. But we're in a world where throughout all of our lifetimes, because the last link to gold ended in the beginning of the 70s, what has happened, and it's in the data, not least in that 2020 Tax Commission survey of economic data for 100 years, what's happened is that governments have made promises they couldn't honestly fund out of taxation, so they've borrowed unsustainably, and ultimately they've debased currencies. Happily take anybody through the graphs, but not now. And what I believe is happening is that this chronic currency debasement that's gone on for 40 years, initially through money creation, through cheap credit, but then subsequently through QE, that is profoundly disruptive to market economies and societies and people's concept of a moral existence exchanging value for value. And it's the fundamental reason why we're in a crisis of political economy, but it's not a crisis of socialism. It's not even a crisis of liberalism properly understood. It's a crisis of socialism. So I've just rattled through that very quickly at no notice. I hope that was satisfactory.
Entirely satisfactory.
But the message I want to leave this audience with is, when stuff gets difficult again, please don't let the left tell you it's our fault or the fault of markets or the fault of Conservatives. It is the fault of chronically making promises you can't keep honestly through tax and then coping with the aftermath. And it's the socialists' fault we're in that mess, not us.
There is no town in Britain better educated on currency debasement than Wickham. That is a typical on-the-doorstep conversation with a voter that you get down there. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed for coming. Before you say thank you to all of our panellists, I've been asked, and I have been asked to do this, to simply draw your attention to a few of the other events that this tent is hosting. And that includes... what is this? Is this immediately after this? So this is next. So this is a conversation about 2050 net zero carbon. And bear in mind, 2050 is one idea. Labour's is 2030. I'm sure that will come up. Good conversation to be had there. Tomorrow, I don't know whether this is AM or PM.
Free breakfast.
AM. There's a conversation about medical cannabis, not recreational cannabis, so that might come up. And then now when's this one happening? This is happening on Tuesday evening. Christian May in conversation. Oh no, Sajid Javid in conversation with me. And I will be giving him a good grilling, I hope. But those are future events, many more. I told you this was the tent for thinking. So please say thank you very much to our panellists. Thank you. Cheers, Christian.